April 18, 1942. The North Pacific, roughly 650 nautical miles east of Tokyo. A gray dawn, a heavy sea, and the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet pitching through 15 feet of swell. Lashed to that deck sat 16 twin-engine bombers that had no business being there. They were United States Army aircraft, land machines, medium bombers built to fly from long concrete runways. Not one of them had ever taken off from a ship. At the front of the pack, in the lead aircraft, sat a 45-year-old lieutenant colonel named James Doolittle, holding the brakes with about 467 feet of wet, heaving deck in front of him and the sea breaking over the bow. The plan had called for launching in the afternoon, closer in under cover of darkness. A Japanese picket boat had ruined the plan 2 hours ago. Now they were going early, going far, and going in daylight, and every man on that deck understood the arithmetic. There was not enough fuel to come back to a carrier, and no carrier could take them anyway. This is the story of how a bomber that was never meant to leave the ground struck the capital of an empire and changed the war in the Pacific. To understand why 16 Army bombers were sitting on a Navy carrier, you have to understand the winter that came before. Pearl Harbor was struck on December 7, 1941. In the 14 weeks that followed, the news from the Pacific was a catalog of American defeat. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines were collapsing. Hong Kong and Singapore were gone. Japan had promised its people that the home islands were sacred and untouchable, beyond the reach of any enemy, and so far the war had proved the promise true. President Roosevelt wanted that promise broken. He wanted a bomb dropped on Tokyo, for the sake of the Japanese High Command and for the sake of an American public that had heard nothing but bad news for a season. The problem was geography. Japanese fighters and picket boats screened the home islands for hundreds of miles out to sea. A carrier could not sail close enough to launch its short-ranged Navy planes without being spotted and attacked first. And no land-based bomber with the range to reach Tokyo could fly from any airfield the Allies still held. The answer, when it came, was a strange marriage. Put long-ranged Army bombers on the deck of a Navy carrier, launch them from far out where the fleet was still safe, and let them fly one way across Japan and on to friendly airfields in China. The bomber they chose was the North American B-25 Mitchell. It was named for Billy Mitchell, the general who had argued for air power between the wars, which made it the only American military aircraft named after a person. It was a medium bomber, a twin-tailed, mid-wing machine crewed by 5 men, a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, a bombardier, and an engineer who also worked the guns. To right are 2,600 twin Cyclone radial engines hung on the wings, each turning out around 1,700 horsepower. The Mitchell had a top speed near 272 miles an hour, a ceiling around 24,000 feet, and standard tanks that gave it a range of about 1,350 miles. It could carry roughly 3,000 pounds of bombs in its belly. It was rugged, honest, and forgiving to fly, and it would hold the air on one engine when it had to. The reason it was picked for this mission came down to 2 numbers. It could get off the ground in a short enough distance to clear a carrier deck, and with modification it could be made to fly far enough to cross an ocean, hit a city, and reach China on the far side. The B-25 was one of the very few aircraft in the American inventory that sat inside both limits at once. Getting it inside those limits took a great deal of work at a base in the Florida Panhandle called Eglin Field. The standard Mitchell carried 646 gallons of fuel. That was nowhere near enough for a flight that would run past 2,000 miles. So the engineers filled the aircraft with fuel wherever they could put it. A leak-proof tank went into the bomb bay above the bombs. A collapsible rubber tank, holding 160 gallons, went into the crawlway that connected the front of the aircraft to the back, so the crew had to climb over their own fuel to move through the plane. A smaller tank went in where the belly gun turret used to be. 10 5-gallon cans went in loose, to be poured into the tanks by hand in flight and then thrown overboard. All told, the fuel load climbed from 646 gallons to 1,141. Then came the subtractions. The secret Norden bomb sight was pulled out of every aircraft, because no one would risk it falling into Japanese hands, and in its place went a homemade aiming device built by one of the pilots, Captain Ross Greening, out of scrap aluminum. It cost about 20 cents to make. They called it the Mark Twain. The heavy belly turret came out to save weight. So did the liaison radio. The tail of the B-25 carried no gun at all, so the crews slid 2 broomsticks into the tail cone and painted them black, so that a Japanese fighter coming up from behind would see what looked like a pair of 50 caliber barrels and think twice. The flying was the hard part. A loaded B-25 wanted a couple of thousand feet of runway to get airborne. These crews would have around 500 feet of carrier deck, and a lot less if they were not the last plane in line. A Navy pilot named Lieutenant Henry Miller was sent to teach 24 Army crews how to do something no one in the Army did: haul a heavily loaded bomber off the ground in the length of a city block. They practiced with the flaps full down and the engines run up hard against the brakes, easing off and hauling the nose up almost the instant the wheels rolled. The shortest takeoff any of them managed in training was recorded at 287 feet. They flew low over water for hours to learn the fuel numbers, and they practiced dropping bombs from a few hundred feet. None of them were told the target. Doolittle picked his men, trained them, stripped and rebuilt the aircraft, and loaded them onto the Hornet at Alameda, California, on the 1st of April. Each plane carried 4 500-pound bombs, 3 of them high explosive and 1 a bundle of incendiaries designed to scatter fire across a wide area. Task Force 16 sailed under Vice Admiral William Halsey. The Hornet carried the bombers on her deck, which meant her own fighters were struck down into the hangar and could not fly, so a second carrier, the Enterprise, came along to fly the air cover for both. Cruisers, destroyers, and oilers screened them across the empty ocean. The plan was to run in to about 400 miles from Japan, launch late in the day, and let Doolittle go first to set fires that the following planes could aim at in the dark. At dawn on the 18th, still more than 600 miles out, the fleet ran into a line of Japanese picket boats. One of them, the number 23 Nitto Maru, saw the ships and got a radio warning off toward Japan before an American cruiser sank her. The choice was ugly and immediate. Launch now, far short of the planned position in daylight with the fuel margin cut to almost nothing, or turn back and dump the whole mission into the sea. Halsey signaled the Hornet to launch the Army bombers. At around 8:20 in the morning, with the deck heaving and the wind and the ship's own speed giving him just enough air over the bow, Doolittle released the brakes, ran up his short stretch of deck, and lifted off with room to spare. One by one the other 15 followed him. Every aircraft got into the air. They flew singly, not in formation, skimming the water at wavetop height to stay under Japanese radar and out of sight. Took them about 5 hours to cross the sea. Near noon, Japanese time, they made landfall and climbed to around 1,500 feet to find their targets. Doolittle's aircraft ran in over Tokyo and let its bombs go on factory and industrial districts. Behind him the others struck across Tokyo, Yokohama, the naval yard at Yokosuka, and the cities of Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Around 10 targets in the Tokyo area were hit, along with others. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was scattered and late, and the fighters that came up mostly failed to find the low, fast, spread-out bombers. All 16 aircraft dropped their loads and cleared the coast. Not one was shot down over Japan. The physical damage was real but small. Some factories, some fuel stores, a light carrier under construction lightly hit. The mission had never really been about the tonnage. It was about proving the thing could be done. Then came the part that no amount of training could fix. The aircraft had launched hundreds of miles farther out than planned, and now every one of them was short of fuel with the coast of China still ahead in the dark and a storm closing in. The airfields that were supposed to guide them in were fogged over and, in the confusion not fully ready. 15 of the 16 crews flew on until the tanks ran dry over China, then either bailed out into the night or crash-landed along the coast. The 16th, low on fuel and unable to reach China, turned north and put down near Vladivostok in the Soviet Union, where the crew was interned. Of the 80 men who had taken off that morning, 3 died getting down, 1 killed parachuting, and 2 drowned when their bomber ditched in the sea. 8 were captured by Japanese forces in occupied China. Of those 8, 3 were executed and 1 died of disease and starvation in a prison cell. The rest, more than 60 men, were hidden, carried, and guided to safety by Chinese soldiers and villagers who moved them west out of Japanese reach, at enormous risk to themselves. The 5 men in the Soviet Union eventually made their way out through Iran in 1943. Doolittle came down in a rice paddy in the dark, found the scattered wreckage of his own aircraft the next morning, and sat on it certain that he had failed. He had lost every one of the 16 aircraft and had no idea yet how many of his men were alive. He believed he would be court-martialed when he got home. Instead, the country treated the raid as the first good news of the war. Doolittle was awarded the Medal of Honor and promoted 2 grades on the spot, from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. When reporters asked President Roosevelt where the bombers had come from, he answered that they had flown from Shangri-La, the hidden mountain kingdom of a popular novel. He was protecting the secret of the carriers and giving the public a legend at the same time. The reprisal fell not on the men who flew the raid but on the people who had saved them. Furious that Chinese civilians had sheltered the American airmen, the Japanese army swept through the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi with around 180,000 troops, destroying the airfields, burning the villages, and killing on a scale that is hard to hold in the mind. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians died in that campaign, and Japanese units spread plague and cholera through the region as they went. It is the darkest fact in the whole story, and it belongs in it. Measured by bomb tonnage, the Doolittle raid changed almost nothing. Measured by everything else, it bent the course of the Pacific War. It broke the promise that the home islands could not be touched, and it forced the Japanese High Command to hold fighter units back over Japan for the rest of the war, defending against a threat that had appeared once out of nowhere. Above all, it settled an argument inside the Japanese Navy. Admiral Yamamoto had been pushing for an operation to destroy the American carriers by drawing them into a battle far out in the Pacific, at a small atoll called Midway. The raid on Tokyo ended the debate. 6 weeks later, Japan sent 4 fleet carriers against Midway and lost all 4 in a single day. The battle that turned the Pacific War was set in motion by 16 Army bombers that were never designed to fly from a ship. The B-25 Mitchell went on to become one of the most widely used bombers of the war, built by the thousands, flown by half a dozen air forces on every front. But the 16 that mattered most were the ones nobody expected to survive their own takeoff. Richard Cole, the young co-pilot who sat beside Doolittle in the lead aircraft that morning, lived to be 103 years old, the last of the raiders. Late in his life, he liked to say that they had only been doing their job. It was a very ordinary way to describe climbing into a stripped-down bomber, aiming it off the bow of a pitching carrier into an ocean of headwind, and flying it one way toward a burning city with broomsticks for guns in the tail.